Round three of the candidates in the books, and man, are things heating up. We had several hard-fought games. Not a single game, actually, was really a peaceful petering out to an easy draw, even though, once again, we had three equal results and one decisive one. I'm going to do things a little bit differently today by diving right into the action, spending less time previewing the games and more time on the actual meat of the analysis. To start off, I'm just going to say that the battle between world champion or former world champion Vishy Anand and Fabiano Caruana, though it was another Berlin, it was another interesting and exciting Berlin. Maybe Maxime Vachier-Lagrave and I are the only ones who feel that way about this particular line, but I think that this 4D3 line, unlike the criticism of Svidler's game with Topalov from round two, is just so rich. So when Vishy repeats himself with D3, the first thought everyone must have is he going to challenge Caruana to come up with an improvement over Topalov's game? Obviously, we know that the Bulgarian lost to the world champion in the first round of the candidates. After bishop to c5, c3, castles, we might be headed right there, but as soon as d6 is played, Vishy reveals his hand playing h3, rather than the move played in both of the previous Berlins we've seen, that of course being knight b to d2. You can, of course, back up and see the other highlight recap videos that we've done after each of the other rounds if you're curious about the information from that line. So what's the story with h3? What's the obvious difference? Well, it prevents black from developing the bishop to g4. Not pinning this knight is going to give white a little bit more pressure on the e5 pawn, especially once d4 occurs. And if white can build up behind that pawn tension, potentially white will have a better piece coordination once the center starts to open up. And so with that, hopefully the next few moves make sense. Knight to e7 is a very typical and common retreat. We've seen it in so many different versions of this 4d3 line. Just gives black a lot of flexibility. Maybe this knight heads to the king side. Many times we want to use the c-pawn to create something. So knight e7 has a lot of purpose. After d4 takes and the bishop voluntarily comes back to d3, we sort of see the idea I was talking about. White has gone out of his way to make sure that this pony is going nowhere, and because of that, white has an immediate threat on e5. Black defends it, and after rook to e1 and then queen to c2, we see what white's preparations are getting ready for the fact that once this pawn breaks, white wants to be in a position where e5 might actually be a threat with the battery of the queen and the bishop on the diagonal. This is theory, of course, but I'm trying to provide a little bit of context so that as we see these top grandmasters improve upon theory, which is one of the great things about watching a candidates event or a world championship, is you pretty much see the best opening preparation in the world, because last game of the year, Dan, why hold anything back now, right? Hashtag Waterboy reference. So here we go. After c takes d4, I thought we were going to see the challenging line. Here Caruana played c5, and so because I was talking about this idea where the queen and bishop battery might go to town, I did a little bit of analysis on e5, and I think it seems interesting, but it ends up failing at least to do it right away because knight d5 comes with an immediate tempo on knight to b4. My first thought was, well, is it really a tempo if I get to play bishop g5 followed by something like a3 to stop the fork? But actually, black has an intermezzo. He can just play knight to b4, exclam, and trade queens the old-fashioned way, which is going to leave black with the bishop pair in the endgame. So actually not enough for white, even though it does play into the fact that white's threats an eventual idea of e5 is partly why black had to be so aggressive here with c5. And it's important to understand that, as I've said before, in these great fighters, every blow is an equal blow in reaction. So black does get more control over the e5 square with Caruana's approach here. However, what's the weakness? Right? Ding, ding, ding. It's an isolated pawn and a positional weakness that's not going anywhere unless black can organize d5. So Vishy puts on his technical shoes and develops his pieces with the idea that if he can trade off dark square bishops, that's only going to strengthen his potential pressure against that weakness. Caruana plays queen to c8, which I liked as a way to kind of protect the bishop and maybe bluff at some ideas over here on the king side. And this is where I was first critical in my analysis that, again, you can check out at chess.com/news and Peter Docker's full report of round three. I was surprised to see bishop take c5. It's a move that I would criticize all my students for playing when, if there's tension in a position, normally you want your opponent to blink first, right? It's all about a game of chicken, and you want them to blink because it usually helps you with your coordination. So if Vishy was really worried about bishop takes h3, the move I suggested was queen to e2, which would guard the knight, kind of take away any bluffs of that sacrifice, and prepare the move rook a to c1, which might be irritating. So a little bit of criticism here for Vishy, although white's still a tiny bit better because of this pawn. And then, unfortunately, we end up returning that criticism right away to Caruana when saying, why, after white goes out of his way to trade, why is black doing the same here? This is really a no-no as far as when you have the stronger piece in the center, let them trade. It might eliminate your isolated pawn, right? Or build up on that tension. Plus, after the moves I analyzed, after something more natural like rook a to d8, I showed that, I mean, is this even with a high-class waiting move like h6, is this really a position that white's thrilled about? If I take, I undo the isolated pawn. Black takes back. I don't like my bishop on e2 for sure. So I didn't really understand it, and I actually think that the criticism of Caruana's move is fair because it is from this moment on that Vishy secures a slight advantage that he only really gives up right at the end. So after bishop takes f3 and some natural moves here, maybe rook a to c1 was better. We essentially get a position where after a little bit of tickle me Elmo, queen's going back and forth, it should be a pretty clear path for white being the one with the cards here. I've got pressure on the d6 pawn. Black hasn't really gotten enough counterplay to justify it, to justify the weak pawn. And Vishy had a number of plans here that he could have gone for. He played the move g3, which makes sense because he's unable to threaten f4 now with bishop e2 because black might just gobble up the pawn. But after g3, Caruana is going to take his opportunity to mix things up and create counterplay. Even with that, though, this is a position that white's up a pawn. All of this pressure notwithstanding, black is never really going to be able to win that pawn without losing his d6 pawn. So best case scenario for black, he hopes to regain both of his pawns for the price of one. You may think that's just a doubled h pawn, and you may be right, but its pawn is a pawn, right? And it is a form of currency no matter where you live. I've checked, all right? It passes all 4x rates. So if Vishy had the right plan here, which I deemed as maybe f3, just overly supporting this pawn, or the computer's plan, which was this nice move b4. The idea behind b4 is actually a really straightforward maneuver. I'm going to play a4, and then I'm going to play b5. My whole goal, to dislodge your bishop from this diagonal, which releases pressure of the pawn, and that's going to allow me to be more aggressive both against your pawn and maybe even with nice moves like f4. So this is a game that maybe with a little more accuracy and not the time pressure that ensued, Vishy might have been able to control and win. He plays this move bishop f3, which is also a nice subtlety. It has some purpose to eventually play h5. I joked in my written analysis that it's a move I would never play, but then again, I would never be Vishy Anand. Here he plays a4, probably a mistake. Again, the computer plan of a3, b4, and still trying to punch this move home is probably white's best. After not doing that, we see the queens go make a few more moves until finally we reach a position that, okay, maybe it wasn't very flashy, but I think both players got their pieces on slightly better squares, and it wasn't until now that Vishy miscalculates and basically gives the draw to Caruana. If he had found the nice move, h5, exclam, ridding this pawn on h4, which ends up being critical, you'll see in lines where that queen picks up the pawn on the diagonal, but also challenging black with a forced line. If black takes the pawn, I can trade everything and just win d6, and there's no way this endgame isn't giving two results for white, right? I'm playing for a win and a draw, up a pawn with the nice rook on the file, and black has no real ways to coordinate the rook and bishop together. That's usually a good judge if you're evaluating who's going to be better in the endgame, rook and knight versus rook and bishop. If there aren't open diagonals in files where the rook and bishop can kind of meet and make that long-distance relationship work, even though we know they all fail on eHarmony, if there's no way for black to do that, then you can trust that the rook and knight will hold their own, and the fact that white's up a pawn means he's just going to be fine. So that was Vishy's chance. Under time pressure, he played the move queen to g3, the only true question mark move of the game, as it just gave back the pawn. Right? I think maybe he just lost a bet to Fabiano last time they were drinking orange juice together in London and said, hey man, next time I hang a pawn, you got to give me it back. And Vishy was like, all right, cool, right? I'm a little tipsy off this orange juice, and that's what happened. So they headed to a rook ending. After queen takes h4, the draw was simply agreed, and that means we move on to our second game to review, which is the battle of another Queen's Indian between Anish Giri and Sergey Karjakin. Now, as we dive into this game, asking you to be excited about the fact that it was a repeated opening of how Karjakin won as white against Hikaru Nakamura from round 2. But I am demanding your attention in regards to Karjakin's opening preparation. And I might smell a rat as far as two of the best prepared players heading into this event. After today, you'll see I feel those players are Karjakin and Aronian, both playing very well. And having spent a lot of time analyzing this game, which isn't something I do all the time these days, I was really impressed to find some of the prep that occurred by Karjakin. No real surprise, he is a Queen's Indian specialist. If you saw yesterday's highlight, I talked about the fact that Karjakin is one of the top grandmasters who plays these positions regularly as black when Nakamura was black. Okay, so a little bit of a different move order in this game between what Karjakin and Nakamura had. But if in this position, if Giri had played queen to c2, it should be noted that knight bd7 would have just transposed into that line. But Giri wants the more aggressive and natural knight e5. And after bishop to b7, bishop to c1, this is our first kind of semi-original moment. The move order ends up transposing into games that have been played, but this retreat is a little bit less common than just the natural rook a to c1. Not going to spend too much time on it. You can check out my written analysis along with MVL's and Peter's news report if you want to see some more. But after bishop to c1, bishop b2, this is all pretty much theory and typical. Knight to d3, also a little bit less common in the move order than bishop to c1, but I'm not going to spend too much time on it because, one, I don't think it really surprised Karjakin. The move order itself didn't reach a very original position outside of a normal Queen's Indian. And so the fact that, both this remaneuver and the knight retreating rather than, say, the other two common moves, which are f4 to reinforce the pony or the always cute and fashionable knight to c4 to take advantage of the pin. I just love showing that move, but because it is actually a common idea in the Queen's Indian. But none of those things was really going to be anything special, so we're going to make a few more moves and get ourselves to our typical Queen's Indian, which kind of is right here, even though knight a4 was the official novelty for realsies this time, as I said in the analysis. I think we were really on original territory right here, but it doesn't seem like it's a far stretch for the imagination as far as thinking this is a Queen's Indian. What do we have? We have white with a small space advantage. You have pressure on the c6 pawn, and it makes black's life difficult to play c5. Why? Because if you ever push the pawn, d5 becomes an instant target. So black is always a little bit worse, sort of superficially to the eye. Objectively, you look at it, though, once you start actually looking for moves, and you realize black's position is fine, even with a little bit less space and all those things. But what was most exciting is after e3, bishop a6, and then rook to e1, the novelty that occurred here, again, we're already in original territory, so this isn't going to be dubbed as a novelty a few moves before, but this idea was really original and one that at first seemingly strange and dubious ends up holding a lot of water, a lot of weight for Karjakin. He plays the move h5. He's a cowboy. And at first I'm thinking, what's the idea? You're not really in great position to attack on the king's side, but maybe you are more than I realized. This bishop has sort of a dangerous eye on this diagonal for tactics. The e4 and g4 squares are both available to ponies potentially. And so after Giri played the move bishop h3, I still liked white, and I think the Indians did too. But then we see the move knight to g4. In my analysis, I thought, okay, maybe black should have just continued with h4, which I think is a move Karjakin might play again if we got this position again, FYI. But knight to g4, as strange as it first looks, has a lot of points to it. The main one being the one that I spent a lot of time on with Komodo, because I looked at this position and I thought, what's preventing white from just playing f3? f3 seems like a super strong move that, okay, if the knight just has to go back, knight to e5 might already be almost winning for white. You just wasted two significant moves. I have a dominant bishop here, and I just love my pony on e5 putting pressure on c6. So that's not an option. I thought, well, is his idea to capture here, intermezzo, but no, if I take it, and then if you go back, still here, at the very least, I'm just really comfortable with the bishop pair, and maybe I can even start to bring my knight back and prepare e4, open the position up. So that wasn't the idea, so it leaves us with only one move black could really play, and that was knight takes e3, but me and Komodo both had this position as winning for white. After queen to d2, bishop takes d3, bishop takes d7, intermezzo, exclam, because by removing that knight, you're preparing the idea of capturing on b6 if indeed black is going to play knight f5. All of these variations were analyzed by me and Komodo, but I'm learning I'm not the only one because watch what happens when I found out that this is not what black intended. Letting this position sit for a while, I realized that black has a much more aggressive idea. h4. Somehow, some way, black is actually going to get a much better attack than you would have expected. How? Let me find the lines to get to the position that we have here. After h4, rook takes e3. h takes g3, h takes g3, bishop takes. Still seems like, okay, well, am I not just going to be up a piece if I trade on e8 and play king to g2? I'm stopping queen h3, and I'm gaining a tempo. But no, rook to e6. Now, I'm no grandmaster or super grandmaster, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night where they just happened to have a free version of Komodo and Stockfish battling it out, evaluating positions. It was weird, a weird Holiday Inn, but I recommend it. Very nice stay. Comfortable pillows. No, in all seriousness, I spent a lot of time on this, and it looks like Black has a huge attack. And so my first criticisms of Giri for not playing f3 back here, and that he must have, I thought maybe he just blundered the intermezzo, bishop takes d7. Not likely for guys like that. I guess I should be a little more cautious in my analysis. But I did come to the right conclusion eventually, again, in realizing that Karjakin's whole piece sacrificed, maybe not winning, but after moves like this, queen e7, exclam, threatening rook e3, forced as this, followed by queen h4, I'm like, right? The mind is being blown here, and I can only assume that this was all preparation. For the record, the mathematical evaluation ends up being equal anyway. Computers defend positions like this every day, though, and I'm sure Giri kind of smelt a rat if he didn't already have this prepared too, and was like, something really weird is going on after f3, and I don't have the energy for this. So he didn't go for it. Instead, he settles. I say settles, but maybe it's not exactly the right term. After knight to g4, he settles not on f3, but knight f4. This move removes the knight from the constant tactics here and attacks h5. Makes sense, because after g6, I take the pawn. White is up a pawn, and still I was looking at this world. All right, after spending all this time with f3, I'm like, do we really buy that Black had preparation still even here, though? Isn't White up a pawn and getting the attack? But not so fast. After natural knight f6 and then bishop e7, there's not only threats of discoveries, but if you try to avoid it with something like queen h6, either we draw by tickle me Elmo, or eventually you try to bring the queen back to h3. And in that case, we might even see lines like rook to c7 followed by bishop to c8. And all of a sudden, Black has a lot of potential on the king side. And this knight is out of play. The light squares are permanently weak. So without spending any more hours than I already did, I had to assume that this idea must have been well prepared by Karjakin, because at this point, Giri kind of folds and says, well, I don't see anything better. I'm worried about your bishop pair. I don't like my misplaced knight on a4. So I'm going to capture on g6, as he did, and accept the perpetual check. He does so in a fancy way with this. I wondered if queen h6 right away is also interesting. But, okay, knight to c5 opens up this second diagonal. Nothing like sacking two pieces just to let it peter out to a draw. And that's exactly what happened. So I commented in my moves that in my written notes for Peter's News that I haven't gone over a seemingly forced draw via preparation that I enjoyed that much in a long time, but it was fun. And I think Karjakin should be watched out for. I mean, obviously in these Queen's Indian positions, it's like, yeah, thanks, Captain Obvious. We know Karjakin is a Queen's Indian specialist. But this game was fun and impressive. I'd love to have these guys making comments, like just off the record, letting me know how much of that really was prep and how much of it was just me blowing hot air. But either way, it's interesting. We move on to the third game of the day, which is Topalov versus Aronian, and had more fireworks than maybe any of the other games as far as round 3 goes. In perhaps the most lopsided game so far of the entire tournament, Levon Aronian just crushed Veselin Topalov with Black in this game. I mean, Topalov was at least slightly worse before move 15, and for all practical purposes lost by move 20-25, which as White doesn't happen very often. So this particular English is very common. It's a choice that Black can play. It looks like sort of a reverse Sicilian when you look at the pawns on c4 and e5, right? But these positions are played. This is considered a very dynamic way for Black to play against the English, so no surprise we see it at a tournament like this. But with every move, we got into more and more uncharted territory, which seemed to favor Levon, not only by the time he was taking. He seemed to be in prep more than Topalov, but just the evaluation of the position just got worse and worse for White, so something was wrong. After knight to d5, e4, knight h4, and d6, we were instantly in nearly uncharted waters. Rook to e8 is the much, much more common move here, but we're going to see that d6 has some interesting ideas, and it's surprising to see that it hasn't been played more often than after this game, hindsight being 2020. But the idea is very simple. Black wants to create more threats by the early bishop development, either to e6 to hit c4, or in some cases to g4 to get annoying types of threats against e2. After knight takes b4, knight takes b4, a3. Although I should note quickly that in my analysis, again, the written analysis for Peter's news reports, I spent a lot of time saying that perhaps a3 in hindsight will be the way white chooses to play this after a3 and castles. It might be a little bit more of a little bit safer option. Though I believe that Levon was going to justify early d6 rather than rook to e8, prove his preparation move order with either bishop to e6 here, which might go into some lines like this that were analyzed. This was all just me and Komodo. White picks up the pawn, but maybe black gets some compensation. But even more than rook e8, bishop e6, I think bishop to g4 is potentially really irritating. The compensation that occurs here is a little more direct. Black is bringing all kinds of heat to e2, and you see just some misplaced pieces. How do we deal with the immediate threat on e2? It's not very easy at all, especially when you consider that you can't turn your back on an idea like g5 coming at a certain point. You make a simple retreating move, natural pressure says, oh, Bob's your uncle, right? You can never push the f-pawn because I'm taking with discovered checks and things are getting weird. So I think bishop to g4, if I had to guess, would have been the lines we would have seen. Time will tell if this line repeats again, but in this particular game, it's irrelevant because Topalov said, all right, I'm going for it. I'm going to grab the bishop pair and play this position the way it's typically done, with d3 trying to pry open the diagonal. But it became really noticeable that Levon was more prepared than Veselin after just a few more moves. d5, castles, takes d3, all typical. And Veselin really needed to take with the pawn here, I think. Maybe he didn't like different ideas, one of them being something like captures and then bishop g4. Black might try to force his way through on the d-file. I think black is doing well in a number of different versions of this endgame, and there's more variations in the written reports in Peter's report. But in the game, Veselin took with the queen. And already after knight to e5, me and a lot of other spectators were like, what's going on here? Is black just winning a pawn? Now, in all fairness, it turns out after deeper analysis that if Veselin had played queen to c2, he could have, after knight takes c4, played an immediate e4. And in this case, it looks like the center is being undermined and it's a little bit harder for black to coordinate. You can't take on e4 because of the knight. And with threats like rook to d1 and bishop to g5, I think white. We're going to get a position of equality, maybe a complex equality, but I think it's okay for white. So it turns out the real big mistake was not just the awkward choice of queen to d3, but the choice to now play queen to d4. After knight takes c4, e4, and then bishop e6, it's already difficult to see compensation for white. The same idea, e4, as in the retreat that I suggested with queen to c2. But the problem is here, white's not able to focus solely on the undermining of the center because the queen ends up being really awkward to tactics. What do I mean? Well, already after b3, the move that Levon played, knight a5, just threatens knight takes b3. If the queen were on c2, that wouldn't be the case. White could continue to focus on undermining this. The other move that was analyzed, and I have to mention it because I spent some time on it with the computer, would be the interesting c5 after b3. Levon didn't play this, but he had the option. What's the trick? If queen takes, now when you play knight to a5 hitting b3, once white defends it, you get to just win the pawn on e4 clearly. So this c5 move sort of draws the queen away, and it is another way of pointing out why I think queen to d4 was just an awkward move. Now, after what Levon did with knight a5, queen to a4, I'm going to say that the position almost never had viable chances for Veselin after this. His last real chance might have been queen to c3. Again, like queen to c2, the queen is not in an awkward position. The queen might even have a future with some battery life over here with the Energizer Bunny. Queen to c3 hits the knight, and so the line I looked at was like c6. Maybe we play something like rook to d1. Bishop to d2 is something that might come in, and there's some relocations of the queen and bishop, again, with the idea being that white is finding some long-term compensation based on the bishop pair and the dark square diagonal. Feels like that was safer. So with those points being made, though, and I'm really, you can tell I'm almost choking on my own words because it's hard for me to believe that at this level someone with the black pieces is already just winning almost on move 15. But I really think that after queen a4 and Levon plays knight to c6, that black was just better from here on out. I'm going to guess that queen a4 was played because of a miscalculation in a couple moves. rook to d1, knight takes e4 had to be a little bit of a surprise to Veselin. My guess is bishop takes e4. He either underestimated or missed that somehow, some way, black is down a piece here, but white can't defend everything, and black still ends up being much better. So without going into all the complicated tactics, at this point, black is basically up 2 pawns, and the compensation for white never materializes. Bishop takes e4 was not played, rather than that bishop to b2. Here comes queen to e7. Now if you take on e4, you're only winning back 1 pawn. So best case scenario for white is settling on being down a pawn and having a weak light squares by giving up this bishop for the knight. Nothing is really happy here for white at all. And a few more moves of just natural chess. f6 is a nice move, just prophylaxis, saying I'm not going to deal with tactics here. Again, white is never really in a position to go gobble back this pawn, despite what the computers say. The computer will suggest that that's the best approach for white, but still say white is worse, because the computer just wants to get back the pawn. But, if you go for that and you're just down a clear pawn and weak light squares, there's no way white is going to hold there in the long term. So white, I think, did the right thing by just trying to keep the pieces on the board and make it dynamic, but it was never enough. After some accurate moves here, especially on bishop to d3, if you want to pause your video and ask yourself, how would you beat back the lions of your opponent bringing tactical threats, you can do that. But if you haven't paused, it's too late. Levon plays aggressively with g5. Accurate defense is often about concrete calculation, and a lot of players lose better positions because once you get an advantage, you feel like you should just win the game. So you kind of want to just intuitively work your way to a win, right? Have you ever done that? We're all guilty where, you were better for sure, but then you realize afterwards that you let it slip because you just didn't want to calculate concretely. You almost felt like you deserved to win now that you already had the advantage. So you didn't want to play an aggressive, risky move like g5. And maybe you settle on a more passive move that ends up doing just as much damage to your king side, but that didn't have the accurate calculation that Levon had with g5. So it's a good lesson to remember that good technique is about, you don't want to take unnecessary risk, but you have to be concrete in your approach, not always relying on the position just winning itself, so to speak. So he played g5 because that tempo itself is all he needs to pop that knight into c4, eliminate white's most dangerous long-term piece. And with that, it was basically all she wrote. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on the fact that there were some more accurate moves for the most part, because Levon was really just winning here as long as he continued to simplify, which he did. But the one thing I will say is once we got to this position, this is where the game almost reopened up when Levon played one very bad inaccurate move. First of all, the brilliant way to deal with the threat of queen to g6 check, which might come in here, is a really nice tactic, knight to g4. Here you guard h6, so queen g6 is just useless. You put the king on h8. And after queen takes g4, you bring the queen to e3, and everybody falls. So knight g4 would have been Levon's most accurate play, but when he played f5, it's not only that it wasn't as pretty as knight g4, but it actually could have opened the door if Veselin, under time pressure, had found this idea with f takes g5 and then rook takes c7. It's not every day you get to sack a rook, win back some material, and maybe increase your drawing chances. So too bad for Veselin, he didn't see that, the idea of deflecting the queen away from g5. But when he missed that, we are finally crossing the line of it's just a matter of technique. He retreated the queen to e2, but now moves are very easy. Black clears the g-file, eventually finds a nice way to not only bring the heat on the g-file, but also remaneuver the queen to the critical diagonal h1, a8, and that was how the West was won. So Levon Aronian getting a huge win there as black. That doesn't happen all the time. There won't be that many of those in this tournament, meaning wins as black, if I had to guess. So remember this game. Remember his preparation, how quickly he was able to really dishevel Topalov's approach as white in the English. Sort of surprising. And with that, we move on to our game of the day between Hikaru Nakamura and Peter Svidler. As we start our Game of the Day review, I must first, once again, of course, give thanks where thanks are due to MVL himself, world number 6. But I'm going to say that even more than the other games that Maxime analyzed, really encourage you, if you want the real deep meat of this game, go to Peter Docker's news report, again, at Chess.com/news, and dive into all the variations. It's just, there's just so much deep stuff going on in this game. I'm gonna go through focusing on some of the practical takeaways I think the majority of players at the level I believe I'm speaking to could take away, but I'm not going to focus on all the complicated variations until we get to more toward the end game where some really instructive stuff happened as far as the rook ending draw. But Maxime did a phenomenal job. Make sure you go check out his analysis at Chess.com. At Chess.com, and here we go. So we have another Slav, a semi-Slav, Peter Svidler, having used this weapon more than a few times before. C5, we've already seen this in round 1, as was noted in Maxime's analysis. Up till here, we've been following the game between Karjakin and Svidler, but here, Hikaru choosing to go for the road most traveled with pawn takes, immediately inviting the IQP, rather than the move played by Karjakin, which, if you remember, was knight takes d4. If not, go check out the video from round 1. So after e takes d4, we get all theory, all very typical stuff here in an isolated queen pawn. The basic ideas as you see players develop, I'll stop here, is white has more active, better coordinated minor pieces, but white has the positional weakness on d4. The general themes repeat themselves in these lines. White wants to use the more aggressively developed pieces to either blow open the center, and when lines do become open, his pieces will get the better of the tactics, because usually better placed pieces have more options, and more options leads to more tactics. We've talked about that. And usually white wants to use some opportunities to attack on the king side if possible. Black is kind of doing the opposite. Black wants to simplify, not over-liquefy, but simplify some of the minor pieces and just try to slowly strangle the pawn, increase the square control around it so that it becomes truly isolated and you can win it. The tactic that always occurs that you have to watch out for is when and where is white going to try to punch the pawn to d5 and create a mess. All those things happen in this game, and that's, again, the reason why bishop takes f6 was played by Hikaru. Normally giving up the bishop that early, you'd think, why, right? But it's all based on some forced lines that involve d5. If you see this again, you might see bishop h4. In fact, a game that was recently played between Vishy Anand and Eli Vajda, I believe, at the Gibraltar Tradewise Chess Festival, not more than just a couple months ago. So bishop h4, of course, is also a move. White doesn't have to take f6, but Hikaru had prep. He had something in mind. He played knight e4, and after b6, knight e5, I thought we were all still pretty. We're all following pretty typical stuff here. And then Svidler plays bishop h4. Now, whether this was part of Hikaru's prep or not, it's hard to tell, but one thing that can be revealing is sometimes how the players are managing their time. And Svidler played bishop h4, and this is where Hikaru first started to think with his novelty and the moves that came right after it, whereas Svidler was busting out moves for the next 10 moves or so. So if that's any clue to us, either Hikaru wasn't fully prepared for bishop h4 or forgot it, or maybe Svidler was more deeply prepared in this line. But Hikaru played a novelty here that makes sense. I mean, g3 is a natural move. The move that had been played before it is this rook a3 idea. White doesn't end up getting enough in the attack, so Hikaru didn't want that. Or as I said, he was sort of surprised by this. But Hikaru played g3, and a few more natural moves. The position is still just about equal, but it's the time that was being taken here that suggested Peter really knew what he's doing. Despite the pawn on d6, this position is a lot more precarious for white than it is for black. Why is that? Well, in the long term, black has the bishop pair still currently, which means if white doesn't convert on something with the active knights now, the bishop should be better long term because the position is very open. Secondly, if you don't convert something with an extended pawn like that, that pawn just ends up being like a runaway calf. It went too far and bad things happen. So either something needs to be done to take advantage of black's time taken to win that pawn, or with the active knights, or you're looking at a lot of features that are potentially unstable for white. Hikaru comes up with a pretty solid plan to not only try to win back one of the bishops, which he does with this move, forcing the trade, but then relocating the pieces to try to attack on that diagonal here. We're going to look at that in a few moves with d7, bishop d3, and now the move queen to e4. There are some other moves that are analyzed here. Again, a lot by MVL. I encourage you to check it out, including maybe queen e3. Maybe white should offer this queen trade to try to win the b6 pawn in exchange for the d7 pawn right away. It's hard to be critical of Hikaru's play here, though. This still was about equal. It's just, again, Svidler was still playing quickly. So he really knew this line well, very deeply. And queen to h6 by MVL was said to be a little too direct, though his suggestion of bishop to e2 and then queen h7 to me didn't seem to change much, in the sense that you still get kind of a similar endgame. where white has to calculate really accurately. In fact, if you look at this crazy line here, white's down a piece, but somehow has enough with these pawns to end up, winning everything back and heading into an equal endgame. I don't know if anybody could have calculated that over the board. That's MVL analysis right there, high quality stuff. But Hikaru just went immediately for queen h7, as we said. And after a few moves, I know this looks really scary. The truth is, though, white has nothing, and black ends up gobbling up just one more pawn than white. Let's see how. After h5, knight e3, knight e5, there's just too many threats here for white to be able to focus on his own attack. So further simplification is needed. With that, knight to d5, of course, is cutting off communication. That's the idea. But really, this is all a lot of smoke and mirrors until a bunch of simplification happens. And in the end, what we realize is white has one more weak pawn than black. So if both of those pawns fall for just one, we have an endgame with a 4-on-3. Now, you might say, as happened in the game, that's a 4-on-3. Is it really that great for black? Don't underestimate winning chances in a 4-on-3 when you have both the rook and the knight on the board. Yes, with just one of those pieces, just the rook, most of those rook endings are drawn, although it has been lost by top GMs, for the record. With just the knights, even more so. It should be a draw. But the rook and the knight both do very well when being able to focus on just one side of the board and not have to worry about passed pawns running and those sort of things. So this position held some real winning chances for Svidler, and so defending it by Hikaru was a good showing of defensive technique. I'm going to go through the moves because they all seem natural. Black is going to try to expand on the king side and use his extra pawn while getting the rook and knight in their optimal position. And white tries to do his best to disrupt that and look to trade pawns whenever you can in these endgames. You have to trade pawns, get yourself in a position where you can draw and take away your opponent's winning chances. So all those things happen. Here Hikaru played g4, which gave me a few heart palpitations when it was played. I was like, can white really do that? But MVL praised this move in his analysis, saying that this is definitely better than just trying to buckle down and sit, because black does have very clear ways to improve, including knight d5, rook to c2, h4, trying to open up the f4 square for that pony. So black had ways to improve, which means Hikaru was smart and to aggressively do something here. Even with giving up that f4 square after knight f1, white really ended up getting all the pieces on their optimal defensive squares and at the right moment offers the rook ending, which is what happens here. Note, of course, that you can't take with check, because I'll just bring the knight back to g2. And after pawn takes, king to g1, this is really just a drawn endgame. It takes a few moves for them to get there, but MVL described this as a position that every player should know. And because of that, I want to show one of the variations that he went over. This is a very common structure that can occur if either you have a 4-on-3 versus your opponent in a rook ending, or they have a 4-on-3. Because the person playing with the extra pawn always wants some sort of dynamic imbalance. He doesn't just want 3 versus 2 equally, right? So this is a position that people are going to try for. And because of that, the position that you should have locked in your head is the one I'm about to show you. This is a very useful takeaway. Pay attention. What MVL shows is that if king g2 had been played, white can basically sit, because there's a very instructive idea that once black establishes this sort of ideal setup, everybody and their cousin has come forward, nothing bad has happened. White has this key idea of rook check and then rook here. What's the threat? You'll see that, okay, if you go back, I repeat, rinse and repeat like shampoo, always, especially if you want to avoid dandruff. But the key is that the threat that seems to be there for black, check and rook f1, is a non-existent one. Go ahead and pause the video if you want to guess white's move. Ding, ding, ding. Rook takes f3. Booyah. Note that this move only works because it's with check. And if black takes with either piece, it's stalemate. If this king were on e5 or g5, this tactic does not work because the rook can give itself up with check and then take, and the king and pawn ending is actually winning for black. So, noting this idea that essentially if you play your cards right, this whole check and remaneuver is not really a threat, as long as you can check the king into a position like this where you can take, then that really changes the ability for a lot of people to play these endings. This is a very useful thing to kind of keep in mind. One of the things that makes strong endgame players versus weak ones is they know all these theoretically drawn positions, so it's harder for them to be tricked even under time pressure, because it's sort of like the Matrix. They just kind of have to keep those positions in mind and drive the game in that direction. Hikaru, I'm sure, was aware of that as well. But we actually never ended up reaching that position, and that's because Hikaru played king to g1. It also ended up going for a drawing line when he played h4. What he saw here was that there was actually no way and I will analyze it with king f5 to prove it. There was actually no way for the king to infiltrate because white has the very nice f3. And as awkward as it looks to have advanced and given the second rank, again, now white just sits with the rook. Never move the king. If you move the king, you allow the rook either here or you allow the rook to go after this pawn. But as long as the rook just sits, this rook basically has no threats. So the position is just a draw. Because of that, after h4, Svidler had to play f3, and now Hikaru had already calculated a forced draw, which was to attack everything and go for a big-time simplification. And that is how our game of the day was drawn. So just amazing stuff from MVL. Awesome rook ending analysis. Really instructive. I suggest you back it up again. Maybe try to map out some of those positions for yourself. I know I did in MVL's analysis because I really learned something from that. And we move on. Giving a quick preview, because we know that we have a break day on March 14th. We are going to talk a little bit about when it comes up. The standings currently show Sergey Karjakin, Levon Aronian, and Vishy Anand all with 2 out of 3. A host of players with 1.5, and then Hikaru and Veselin Topalov right there at the bottom. Still a ton of chess left to be played. No one knows what's happening. The round 4 pairings will show Svidler as white versus Aronian, Karjakin as white versus the former world champion, Nakamura is white versus Giri, and finally Caruana is white versus Topalov. All the times are available for you there. Make sure you mark your time zone. Don't miss it at Chess.com. Follow all the live games. And finally, I'll say that make sure you use your rest day wisely. March 14th, if you're watching this on Sunday, is going to be a full day of chess on Chess.com/TV. You can follow the hashtag ChessTV. Seriously, we have Panamaria versus Vallejo Pawns. We have all kinds of great shows on Chess TV. Make sure you subscribe to our channel right now. Click subscribe. Don't go anywhere before you do that. And keep following all the action at Chess.com. We'll see you soon.